Hi, my name is Clayton Peterson, and today I'm going to discuss the current hate speech laws in Canada. And in doing so, I'm going to provide a recommendation for the federal government that would allow for this law to operate more effectively and smoothly than it currently is. So, in order to discuss hate speech, we need to talk about Canada as a whole. So, when you talk about Canada, it's important to know that Canada is among the world leaders on multiculturalism and diversity. If you were to go into a university classroom or a community center, you were going to see individuals who differ in all ways of life, whether that be race, religion, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation. There's very much different avenues of diversity within the country. And for the most part, this is what makes this country so appealing to those around the world. Roughly 1 in 5 Canadians today are immigrants, and there's been a huge influx of immigration over the last few decades in the country. And for the most part, this is due to, again, the acceptance of all in the country. However, this acceptance hasn't been prominent for all that long. If you look at the history, there's been a vast history of racism and hate within the country, and this was evident in the late 1960s. So, in discussing the current hate speech laws, it's important to talk about where they came from. So, in 1965, there was hate speech primarily portrayed towards Jewish individuals after the Second World War, as well as black individuals within the country. So, to combat that, the Cohen Committee was formed and passed the first legislature that would become to know as the current hate speech laws. And in doing so, they coined this term identifiable groups. This meant individuals or groups that could be identified through personal characteristics such as race, religion, and ethnicity. Those were the three identifiable groups at the time of these laws being instituted. However, in 2004, these identifiable groups also included the discussion of sexual orientation. In 2013, they removed the Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, which meant that individuals couldn't be prosecuted for online hate speech messages. And in 2017, the identifiable groups grew again with the inclusion of gender identity and expression. So again, talking about the current hate speech laws, we have to obviously talk about the laws itself. So those fall under Section 318 and 19 of the Criminal Code. If you look at the current hate speech laws, it's important to note that there are no mandatory minimums, meaning that if I am convicted of hate speech, I can be subjected to no formal punishment at all whatsoever. And this is a problem that I'm going to discuss further. However, in prosecuting these laws, it's important to look at the defenses, primarily Section 319.3. The defenses being if the statements that the individual said were in fact true, and, which is the most common one, is the argument based on religious beliefs. So when you look at individuals who, like Bill Walcott, is an anti-gay activist who is very much Christian, his defense is based on his religious beliefs and his religious texts. So Canada hate speech laws are very much effective in some ways. However, there's a lot of problems with them. One problem is the subjectivity of the word hate. What I view as hateful may differ than what my mom may view as hateful. And this has been shown through countless court cases and judges' decisions. Most prominently, I want to focus on the case of James Keekstra. Keekstra was an anti-Semitic individual who taught anti-Semitic views. So in his first original provincial case, he was found guilty. However, on appeal, this was overturned. Again, he was found not guilty now. Then this was appealed to the Supreme Court, and in a 4-3 decision, granted, keep in mind how close that is, it was overturned and he was then found guilty. So in 3 separate cases, they got 3 separate results. And this speaks to how subjective the idea of hate is. And this causes a lot of problems in the number of appeals that we see within relation to this law. The second problem is the lack of deterrence. So like I mentioned, James Keekstra, his court case took from 1984 and didn't get solved until 1990. This costed the government millions of dollars, and in doing so, all he received was a $5,000 fine and 100 community hours. This is important to note because individuals like Mike Ward, who was a comedian who said a very harsh joke, he was ordered to pay $47,000. So there's a very obvious discrepancy in relation to the lack of deterrence. So some individuals are not even really seeing any criminal sanctions for that matter. And the third part is whenever these cases are prosecuted, it is a charter right infringement by the state on their freedom to expression. In often cases, the government cannot prove that this was a justifiable limitation of their freedom of speech or freedom to religion. Therefore, these cases are often overturned. So just a few prominent cases that I suggest you, if you have time, look into is the Keekstra case, like I've mentioned, Zundel, who's a Holocaust denier, Walcott, who's an anti-gay activist, and Mike Ward, like I mentioned. He was actually on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he goes into great detail on his case. So my question for this is, what are some better policy options? And I have 3 that I'm going to provide with you. The first is a restructure of the current court proceedings. So I would like to see, instead of one judge or a jury, a panel of judges. That way there's no preconceived biases where one individual can ultimately decide the fate of this case. For example, these cases are often subjected to appeals. And in order to get an appeal, you must get an approval for your appeal. However, if 5 out of the 5 judges determine that your degree of hate or speech is hateful, then it's likely that that appeal will not be approved. Also, I would like to see a day limit, meaning that these cases from start to finish must be decided in 9 months. This would just increase the amount of cases that can be heard, as well as increase the overall scheduling and swiftness of the courts. Some disadvantages, though, is with the day limit, it could push judges to make a not as detailed decision, as well as if these cases do, however, get approved for an appeal, it ultimately was kind of pointless. The next option I'm going to provide are mandatory minimum fines in guilty cases. So like I said with Keekstra, he only had to pay $5,000. And I would like to still see other sanctions such as community hours along with the mandatory minimum fines, but this is just another form of deterrent that often isn't seen. So for example, in the fines that I want to see a minimum of $10,000 with a maximum of $250,000. However, I want the degree of the fine based on the individual's annual salary. So if an individual makes, $1 million, I think that they should have to pay 25% of their income. In doing so, this would ensure responsibility and provide a deterrent that often is not seen. As prison obviously isn't as common in these cases, this is another measure that could hold these individuals responsible. This first came prominent in Scandinavian countries with parking tickets and speeding tickets. Their tickets were often based on their annual income, and it's actually been very much successful. Some advantages is it obviously provides a deterrent, and the governments could use these fines in order to provide education on diversity in schools or other avenues. Some disadvantages is obviously if the fines aren't paid, this could result in prison time, which only costs the government more. However, I would like to see financial aid provided, for example, an extensive amount of time to pay this fine. And in doing so, if there's a mandatory minimum fine, this would not allow for any form of discretion. The last policy option would be the government investment of monitoring online platforms. So for example, Facebook. I want to see the current government invest money into hiring individuals to combat hate speech. So delete hate speech posts, ban people who do decide to post hate speech, and just allow for a greater presence of online monitoring of hate speech. In doing so, it would allow for the elimination of hate speech, which could lower the overall hate crimes, as 75% of hate crimes in Canada are a direct result from hate speech online. This was provided by Stats Canada. It would also limit the influence hate speech can have on an individual. For example, a young person who sees this might not be as influenced because they're not going to see it. However, the disadvantages is big websites like Facebook, Instagram, there's going to be a problem with that because they are such a large website with millions of viewers that it's difficult to combat that. And it's difficult for government to go into a privately owned business and try and tell them what they can and can't do. So my recommendation for this would be mandatory minimum fines. The overthrow of the current court proceedings would be very much difficult to do, as well as the online hate speech. It's just such a large problem, and there's millions and millions of viewers that it's not entirely realistic to eliminate it. While we can decrease it, it just would be a better investment to and much more realistic to provide mandatory minimum fines as the recommendation for this policy. Thank you.